Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The world wasn't prepared for Superman. His arrival had shattered countless preconceived notions of what was possible. For years, humanity had asked themselves, could there be someone like him out there? And when Superman first appeared in his iconic red and blue suit, that question was answered with resounding awe and fear. No one, not even the smartest minds on Earth, could fully comprehend what they were seeing, except Tony Stark. To the billionaire inventor, Superman wasn't a myth or a miracle. He was a puzzle, an enigma of biology, physics, and technology that, if unraveled, could push humanity to new heights. From the moment Superman's existence was confirmed, Tony had been fixated on him, but in recent years his curiosity had morphed into something more: obsession. Tony stood in his lap staring at the holographic model of a Kryptonian energy source he'd reconstructed from fragments of data. The room was dim, only the light from the glowing blue reactor in front of him illuminating his face. He had been working on this project for months, meticulously reverse engineering what little information he had. In theory, this reactor could generate infinite power using the same principles that fueled the destruction of Captain Superman's lost homeworld. Iron Man's great, Tony muttered to himself as he examined the intricate designs floating before him. But Superman is something else entirely. Tony had long since concluded that Kryptonian technology was light years ahead of human science. He saw a future where humanity no longer feared alien invasions or energy crises. In his mind, unlocking the secrets of Superman's power was the key to ensuring Earth's survival and dominance in the galaxy. But deep down, beneath the layers of bravado, Stark knew what this was really about. It was a game, a challenge. If Superman was the apex of evolution, then Tony Stark was determined to prove that even gods could be understood and perhaps replicated. As he continued tweaking the reactor's algorithm, he was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. His AI assistant, Friday, appeared in the corner of his vision. "Mr. Stark," her voice echoed softly. "You've got a visitor. Mr. Kent is here." Tony smirked. Of course he is, right on time. Clark Kent, dressed in his typical reporter garb of slacks and a button-down, stepped into the lab. To the average eye, he appeared unremarkable, a tall, quiet man who wouldn't draw attention unless you were looking for him. But Tony Stark knew better. He knew that behind the calm exterior was a being of unimaginable power, capable of reshaping the world with just a thought. "Clark," Tony said, not looking up from his work, "what can I do for you?" "I am not here as Clark Kent," Superman replied, his voice a deep, controlled baritone. He removed his glasses, the transformation into the Man of Steel happening in an instant. His posture straightened, his face became more intense, and his piercing blue eyes met Tony's. "I came because I've been hearing things rumored." Tony finally glanced up, crossing his arms. "Rumors, huh? Well, you know, the press, they're always stirring something up." "Superman," didn't he smile? "This isn't about the press. This is about you." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "You've been experimenting with Kryptonian technology." Tony let out a low whistle, straight to the point. "I like that." Superman's expression remained stoic. "I've let you work on your projects in the past, Tony. I've just given you the benefit of the doubt. But this," he gestured to the reactor behind Tony, "this is crossing a line." "A line?" Tony's eyes lit up with challenge. "No offense, but you are not exactly the authority on drawing lines when it comes to humanity, so progress." Superman stepped forward, his gaze never wavering. "That reactor. Han, you don't understand what you were dealing with. Kryptonian technology isn't tied like anything on Earth. It's sent dangerous, Tony." "Dangerous," Tony repeated, his tone sarcastic. "Well, that's kind of my specialty, isn't it? Besides, we could use a little danger. Do you realize what this reactor could mean for Earth's unlimited energy? No more fossil fuels, no more wars over resources. This could change everything." Superman's jaw tightened. "At what cost? Krypton was destroyed because of the very technology you were trying to harness." Their arrogance in believing they could control forces beyond their understanding led to their extinction. Tony waved him off. "Krypton was destroyed because they didn't have me." Saw the holographic display, tapping a few buttons on the console. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but I've got this under control. I am not some reckless scientist playing with fire. I know what I am doing." Superman's voice was quiet but firm. "No, Tony, you don't. There was a long silence, the air in the room thick with tension. Finally, Tony sighed and turned to face him fully. So what's your plan? Are you going to stop me? Shut this down. I am asking you to stop before it's too late, Superman said, before you put the entire planet at risk. Tony's eyes hardened. I want to stop. This is bigger than you or me. This is about the future of humanity. Superman studied him for a moment, then shook his head slowly. You think you re-helping, but you re-on the same path that Captain followed. You were blinded by your ambition. Tony clenched his fists. And what? I am just supposed to sit back and let you be the only one with power, the only one who can save the world. What happens when you re-nod around, Clark? Superman met his gaze evenly. This isn't all about power. It's all about responsibility. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Tony looked like he might reconsider, but then he turned away, his face set with determination. You should leave, Tony said quietly, his back to Superman. I have work to do. Superman stood still for a long moment, his eyes lingering on the reactor. He could feel the energy pulsing from it, the dangerous potential it held. But he also knew that Tony Stark wasn't someone who could be easily swayed once his mind was made up. Without another word, Superman turned and walked out of the lab, leaving Tony alone with his ambition. Tony wasn't one to second-guess himself ever since his first creation. His genius had always been the guiding force of his decision. But as he stood there watching the holographic display in front of him, Clark's echoed in his mind, blinded by your ambition. Friday, Tony said, his voice unusually quiet. Yes, boss. The AI run a diagnostic on the reactor. I want to make sure there's no risk of... Suddenly, the reactor's core flashed bright, filling the room with a blinding light. The air hummed with a deep resonating vibration, and the ground beneath Tony's feet trembled. His instincts kicked in immediately. He rushed to the console, frantically typing commands to stabilize the reactor. Friday, what the hell just happened? The AI's voice was unnervingly calm. The reactor is experiencing an energy surge. Mr. Stark, Kryptonian energy levels are rising beyond safe threshold. Tony's fingers flew over the keys. Shut it down now. I am afraid that's not possible. The core is already destabilizing. Tony cursed under his breath. This was worse than he anticipated. He could see the energy levels skyrocketing, surpassing anything he'd ever encountered. The reactor safes weren't enough to contain it. The power of Krypton was far more volatile than he had predicted. Outside the lab, the sky began to darken unnaturally. People in cities around the world looked up, confused and fearful as the atmosphere shifted, heavy with the strange electric charge in the air. Buildings trembled and energy grids started to fail. Planes fell from the sky as the Earth's magnetic fields began to falter. And in the center of it all, Tony Stark stood in his lab, watching the numbers on his screen rise uncontrollably. I can fix this, he whispered to himself. I just need more time. But time was something he no longer had. Superman stood on the balcony of his apartment in Metropolis, watching the horizon as the sky shifted. He had felt at the moment it happened, the surge of Kryptonian energy radiating across the planet. It was a familiar, almost haunting sensation, like the ghost of his homeworld reaching out from the grave. He had hoped Tony would listen. He had hoped that Stark, for all his brilliance, would see the danger before it was too late. But now, as the world around him started to fracture, Superman knew what he had to do. He took off into the sky, his cape billowing behind him, heading straight for Stark's tower. Inside the lab, Tony was still fighting to stabilize the reactor when Superman crashed through the window, landing with a force that shook the entire building. I warned you, Superman. Sen's voice was sharp, his usually calm demeanor gone. Look what you've thought. Tony didn't stop his frantic attempts to control the reactor. I've got it under control, he shouted back. No, you don't, T. Superman stepped forward, his eyes glowing with intensity. And you were going to destroy the planet if you don't, T. Stop this. I am not giving up, Tony yelled, his face flushed with exertion. He slammed his hand on the console, but nothing seemed to respond. The reactor continued to surge, its energy levels now beyond anything even Superman had encountered. Superman knew there was only one way to stop this. Now he moved toward the reactor, his hands outstretched, his body absorbing the waves of energy pouring from it. Tony Stark's eyes widened as he saw Superman approach the reactor. His body was already glowing faintly as it absorbed the Kryptonian energy spilling into the lab. The air crackled with power, the hum of the reactor reaching a fever pitch. "What are you doing?" Tochi shouted, his voice strained as he backed away from the console. "You can just absorb it. This isn't true. Some solar energy trick you can pull. It's Kryptonian tech. It's sound safe." Superman didn't respond. His face was tense, focused, every muscle in his body tightening as he struggled to contain the energy coursing through him. The pressure was immense, even for him. Tony had been right. This wasn't just another power surge. This was a force born from a world far more advanced, far more dangerous than Earth, and it was threatening to consume them both. Tony felt a tremor in the floor beneath him. The entire tower was shaking now, the structure groaning as the energy destabilized the foundation. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance, eyes darting back and forth between Superman and the reactor. He wanted to help, to do something, anything, but the calculations in his head kept reminding him of the truth. There was no shutting this down. "Friday emergency shutdown now. Our shutdown procedure is unresponsive, Mr. Stark. The reactor has reached critical levels." Tony swore under his breath, his mind racing. He couldn't let it end like this. Not after all the work, all the promises he had made. The idea that his experiment could save the world had driven him forward, had fueled his ambition. But now it's all crumbling apart. Superman, voice cut through his thoughts, strained and full of effort. Tony said, "Get out of here." Tony's jaw clenched. He could see the pain on Superman's face, the sheer exertion it took for him to keep the reactor's energy from ripping apart the lab, the city, maybe even the planet. And yet, even in that moment, Superman wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about everyone else. "You've got to be kidding me." Tony muttered, "I'm not leaving you here to blow yourself up." "You don't have a choice." Superman gritted his teeth, his eyes now glowing with the intensity of the energy inside him. "If you stay here, you'll die. This place is coming down." Tony glanced at the console again, his hands twitching with the need to fix something, anything. His heart pounded, torn between his ego, his drive to prove that he could control this situation, and the reality that Superman was the only thing standing between Earth and total annihilation. Suddenly, the reactor emitted a high-pitched whine, and the energy around it surged, exploding outward in a wave of pure force. The glass in the windows shattered, and Tony was thrown back, slamming into the wall with a grunt. His vision blurred, the sound in his ears replaced by a dull ringing. He struggled to stand, his entire body aching, but he knew time was running out. The force hitting him full on, but he didn't fall. His body absorbed the blast, though it was clear the strain was getting to him. He turned his head slightly toward Tony, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Go now." For a split second, Tony hesitated. He had always believed that with enough time, enough tech, he could solve any problem. But now, seeing Superman standing there, holding back the full force of a dying world's technology, Tony knew there was no solution to this, not one he could build anyway. With a grimace, he activated the emergency exit on his suit. The Iron Man armor wrapped around him in a matter of seconds, and the helmet clicked into place. He hovered above the floor, his thrusters ready to take him out of the building in an instant. But before he left, he cast one last look at Superman, the man who was now glowing like a living star, fighting to keep the world from burning. "You better not die, Kent," Tony muttered before rocketing through the open window out into the chaotic sky. The moment Tony cleared the building, he could see the full extent of the disaster. The sky was split with lightning, unnatural and furious, as the energy from the reactor spread out in violent bursts. People were evacuating the surrounding streets, chaos erupting in every direction. He pushed his suit to its limits, flying higher, scanning the area below for any sign of control. Nothing. The reactor was too far gone. Inside the lab, Superman was reaching his limit. The energy was now tearing at him from the inside, every fiber of his being screaming in pain as he tried to hold it back. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced so many threats in his life. Superman, Sen's mind flashed back to Krypton, to the stories his father had told him about their home, Seth's destruction. It had been their pride, their overconfidence in their technology that had doomed them. They had believed they could control the forces of the universe, harness the power of their sun and bend it to their will, and it had destroyed them. Now here he was, standing in the midst of that same mistake, trying to prevent history from repeating itself. but the weight of it all was overwhelming. His vision blurred, his muscles screamed for relief, and he could feel the energy eating away at his very being. If this continued any longer, he wouldn't be able to contain it. With a surge of determination, Superman gritted his teeth and pushed harder, pulling every ounce of strength from within himself. He wouldn't let this happen. He wouldn't let Captain's mistakes destroy another world. The reactor continued to surge, its energy climbing higher and higher. Superman's south body was glowing brighter, now the light almost blinding as he struggled to hold back the inevitable. Outside, Tony Stark hovered in the sky, watching in horror as the building shook and cracks spread through the foundation. The reactor was nearing its final moments. If Superman couldn't tame it, Tony. This was it. This was it. He hovered there, frozen, knowing there was nothing more he could do. He had created this mess, he had pushed too far too fast, and now the cost would be unimaginable. But then, just as the reactor reached its peak, there was a shift in the air. The storm clouds above parted, and the energy crackling through the sky began to dissipate. The glow from the reactor dimmed, and the tremors stopped. Superman, still glowing with the remnants of Kryptonian power, had done it. He had stabilized the reactor, just as it teetered on the brink of catastrophe. Tony let out a breath. He didn't realize he was holding his hands trembling inside his suit. He descended slowly, landing on the wrecked street below as he watched the tower settle. The danger seemingly passed, but it wasn't over, not yet. Inside the lab, Superman fell to his knees, his body still radiating with the residual energy. He had stopped the immediate threat, but he knew that the reactor was still unstable. Thought it was only a matter of time before it would go critical again. Tony rushed back inside, his suit's thrusters burning as he flew up to the lab. When he arrived, the sight of Superman on the ground, weakened but still alive, sent a surge of relief through him. But the relief was short-lived as Tony sat outside of the reactor, still pulsing faintly, though far less aggressively. "How long do we have?" Tony asked, his voice tense as he approached. Superman looked up, his face pale and tired. "How long? Maybe minute." Tony's mind raced. He had run the calculations. He had done everything in his power to make this reactor work, to harness the energy of Krypton. But now all of it had been for nothing. He couldn't save it. He couldn't tap it. I'm sorry, Tony said, his voice quiet. Superman shook his head, standing slowly, though his body trembled from the effort. "It's not too late," he said, his voice still steady despite the exhaustion. "Dear, we can stop this together." Tony blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. "How?" Superman glanced at the reactor, his expression grim. "Fiery, we have to destroy it. That's the only way." For a moment, Tony hesitated. Destroy it. All of that work, all that time, gone in an instant, but he knew Superman was right. There was no saving it now. Together they stood before the reactor, the last vestiges of Krypton, as power humming dangerously in the air. With a final nod to each other, they acted. Superman's fists glowed with energy, and Tony's suit powered up to its maximum output. In a blinding surge of force, they struck the reactor simultaneously, shattering it into pieces and releasing the remaining energy in one final controlled burst. The room went silent. The crisis was over. Tony slumped against the wall, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had come so close to destroying everything he had sworn to protect. And it was Superman, the one he had thought of as a puzzle to solve, who had saved them all. Superman, still standing, took a deep breath, his body finally beginning to recover. He looked at Tony, his expression softening. "You didn't need to prove anything," Superman said quietly. "You're already one of the greatest minds on Earth, but sometimes even we need help." Tony stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Yeah, Sarah," he muttered. "Sometimes we do." As the two men walked out of the wrecked lab, side by side, Tony couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. He had been humbled, something that didn't happen often, but maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. For the first time in a long time, Tony Stark wasn't trying to save the world on his own.